In Vietnam, when people speak of the war, they often whisper about the Trường Sơn, a spine of mountains that carried more than trees and mist. It carried hunger, it carried fear, it carried the weight of a divided nation. The world came to call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but for the Vietnamese who walked it, slept in its mud, and buried their comrades beneath its canopy, it was never a legend, it was a lifeline. And hidden beneath that lifeline, buried under red earth, submerged in rivers, threaded through mountains, was another road, not of stone, not of footprints, but of fuel, a pipeline. It did not roar like artillery, it did not leave craters in the ground, it did not appear on foreign television screens, it moved silently. From 1968 onward, while bombs fell from American aircraft and forests burned under chemical spray, Vietnamese engineers and soldiers began building something no one outside the country could see: a river of fuel flowing through jungle and mountain. Later, foreign engineers from China, from the Soviet Union, even from the United States, would look at what had been built and struggle to understand how it was possible under such conditions. But in those years, inside Vietnam, it was not about impressing anyone. It was about survival. Because without fuel, trucks would stop in the mud. Without fuel, food would not reach the front. Without fuel, tanks would rust in silence. Without fuel, the war, for better or worse, would simply collapse. This is the story of the road that could not be seen, the road that ran beneath the jungle, the road built in secrecy, under bombardment, across a broken land, the pipeline along Trường Sơn. By 1968, the war inside Vietnam had entered a new and unforgiving phase. After the Tet Offensive, the battlefield did not quiet down, it hardened. Supply lines became targets, roads were cratered overnight, convoys burned before reaching their destination. Inside the headquarters of the General Logistics Department, the question was no longer theoretical. How long could a war continue without fuel? Fuel was not ideology. Fuel was not speeches. Fuel was not slogans shouted across rice fields. Fuel was movement. A truck without fuel was a coffin on wheels. A tank without fuel was a bunker of steel. An aircraft without fuel never left the runway. From 1968 to 1974, under constant bombardment, Vietnamese soldiers and engineers would lay down nearly 5,000 kilometers of pipeline through jungle, river, and mountain. At the time, it would become one of the longest wartime fuel pipeline systems ever constructed. But those numbers meant little to the men digging trenches by hand. They worked at night. They covered their tracks at dawn. They buried steel beneath mud while aircraft circled overhead. Each meter of pipe laid was a gamble. If discovered, it would be bombed. If broken, fuel would spill into the soil. If delayed, units in the south would wait, without supplies. Senior logistics officials understood what was at stake. There were moments when leaders declared that no cost was too great for the completion of this line, because without it, everything else would falter. The pipeline was not a symbol of glory. It was an artery. And the war, whether one supported it or feared it, now depended on whether that artery could keep flowing. In 1968, the bombing intensified. American aircraft hunted movement along the mountains of Trường Sơn. Roads were watched, river crossings were targeted, fuel convoys became visible scars in the jungle, and scars attracted bombs. Truck after truck was destroyed before reaching the southern battlefields. The question was no longer how to build a pipeline. The question was more immediate. How do you move fuel at all? At first, there was no grand design. There was improvisation. Fuel was poured into plastic bags, tied tight, packed into rucksacks. Young soldiers walked for days under the canopy, each man carrying a weight that smelled of gasoline and danger.
200 men could move less than 2 barrels, and even that came at a cost. Gasoline soaked through fabric, vapors built up in the heat. Some soldiers grew dizzy from the fumes, others collapsed from exhaustion before they reached the next station. It was fuel measured in sweat. When that failed to meet demand, metal cans were used. 20-liter containers strapped to backs, stacked onto bicycles, floated across streams. Sometimes fuel drums were pushed through shallow rivers, guided quietly by hand in the dark. But time betrayed them. 2 weeks of movement could supply trucks for 2 days. In a war that moved daily, that equation was impossible. Engineers then gathered whatever pipe they could find: water pipes, discarded industrial tubing, even hollowed bamboo. They stitched short segments together, experimenting in remote clearings. For a few dozen meters, it worked. For 100 meters, perhaps. But bamboo swelled, joints leaked, pressure split the seams. 1,000 kilometers of jungle could not be conquered with fragile improvisation. The crisis deepened. Somewhere in the forests of central Vietnam, men stood over maps marked with bomb craters and river crossings, knowing that without a new solution, the southern fronts would slowly starve of movement. The war was not being decided only by battles. It was being decided by fuel and by whether it could reach those who waited for it. While soldiers struggled to move fuel by hand through the forests of Trường Sơn, discussions were also happening far from the jungle. In Moscow, during an official visit, General Vong Wen Giap observed something that would linger in his mind long after the meetings ended. The Soviet Union moved fuel across vast distances through steel arteries that stretched beyond the horizon. Oil did not rely on trucks, it flowed. In the Soviet landscape, pipelines crossed plains under the protection of a powerful air defense network. They were designed for scale, for industry, for permanence. Vietnam was different. Vietnam was being bombed. When the idea of a wartime fuel pipeline was brought back home, it was not greeted with applause. It was met with silence. The obvious differences were obvious. The Soviet Union had depth, space, industrial redundancy. Vietnam had jungle, mountains, and aircraft overhead. Soviet pipelines could be dismantled after a campaign. Vietnam needed something that would survive for years. In a meeting of logistics commanders, the room held more doubt than certainty. Maps were spread across tables, red arrows marking bombed roads, blue lines tracing rivers, black circles marking destroyed depots. Who would take responsibility for such an undertaking? It was then that Lieutenant General Dinh Duc Tien, head of military logistics, spoke. He did not promise ease. He did not promise speed. He promised to try. If fuel could not move above ground, it would move below it. If trucks could be seen, pipes would remain unseen. If bombs destroyed roads, the earth itself would become the corridor. The decision was not romantic, it was calculated risk. Because once construction began, there would be no turning back. Steel would have to be transported piece by piece through contested territory. Pumping stations needed power, crews needed protection, and all of it had to remain secret. Failure would mean more embarrassment, it would mean shortages at the front. But hesitation also carried consequences. And so the order was given, not to build a monument, but to build a lifeline beneath the war. Once the decision was made, the real battle began. It would not be fought with rifles, it would be fought with shovels, steel, silence, and time. Along the slopes and valleys of Trường Sơn, construction teams moved in fragments. No large columns, no obvious supply depots. Every shipment of pipe was broken down, disguised, rerouted. Secrecy was not optional. If American reconnaissance detected a pattern, fresh soil, unusual traffic, disturbed riverbanks, bombs would follow. And bombs did follow. There were days when sections that had taken weeks to bury were torn open in minutes, earth thrown skyward, steel twisted, fuel leaking into the mud. Sometimes the strikes were so precise that suspicion spread quietly among the ranks. Was there informant activity? Were signals being intercepted? Was the jungle itself betraying them? Security tightened, patrols intensified, movement became slower, more cautious. But the Americans had aircraft, sensors, aerial photography, and data analysts studying the terrain. This became a duel of calculation. To cross rivers, engineers sank the pipes deep beneath the riverbed, weighting them carefully so floods would not carry them away. Across rice paddies, pipes were buried so deeply that farmers could continue planting above them, water buffalo plowing fields while fuel moved silently below. In the mountains, the challenge grew harsher. Some passes rose nearly 1,000 meters. Gravity became an enemy. Too little force, and the flow would stall.